At 15, I decided to do my history project on nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. Time to learn my history, I decide. I weave through book after article after website, all on how the US wants to use my island home for nuclear testing. I sift through political jargon, tables of nuclear weapons with names like Operation Bravo, Crossroads, and Ivy. Quotes from generals like, 9,000 people are out there. Who cares? I'm not mad at all, really. I already knew all of this. I glance at a photograph of a boy, peeled skin, arms, legs suspended, a puppet, next to a lab coat lost in his clipboard. I read firsthand accounts of what we call jelly babies, tiny beings with no bones, skin, red tomatoes, the miscarriages gone unspoken, the broken translations. I never told my husband. I thought it was my fault. I thought there must be something wrong inside me. I flipped through snapshots of American Marines and nurses, branded white with bloated grins, sucking beers and tossing beach balls along our shores. And my islander ancestors, cross-legged before a general, listening to his fairy tale about how it's for the good of mankind, to hand over our islands. Let them blast radioactive energy into our lazy-limbed coconut trees, our sagging breadfruit trees, our busy fishes that sparkle like new sun, into our coral reefs, brilliant as an aurora borealis woven beneath a glassy sea. God will thank you, they told us. Yeah, as if God himself ordained those powdered flakes to drift onto our skin, our hair, our eyes, to seep into our bones. We mistook radioactive fallout for snow. God will thank you, they told us. As if God's just been waiting for my people to vomit all of humanity's sins onto impeccable white shores, gleaming like the cross burned into our open, scarred palms. At one point in my research, I stumble along a photograph of goats tied to American ships, bored and munching on tubs of grass. At the bottom, a caption read, "Goats and pigs were left on naval ships as test subjects. Thousands of letters flew in from America protesting animal abuse." At 15, I want megatons of TNT, radioactive energy in a fancy degree, anything and everything I could ever need to send ripples of death through people who put goats before human beings, so their skin can shrivel beneath the glare of hospital room lights 3 generations later as they watch their grandmother, their mother, their cousin's life drip across that same black screen, knots of knuckles tied to steel beds, cold and absent of any breath, but I'm only 15. So I finished my project. Graph my people's death by cancer and canned food diabetes on flowcharts in 3D. Glue stick my ancestors' voice onto a poster board I bought from Office Max. Staple tables screaming the millions of dollars stuffed into our mouths generation after generation after generation. And at the top, I spray painted in bold stenciled yellow, "For the good of mankind," and entered into a school district-wide competition called History Day. My parents were quietly proud, and so was my teacher. And when the 3 balding white judges finally came around to my project, one of them looked at it and said, "Yeah, but it wasn't really for the good of mankind though, was it?" And I lost.
Sure. So the notion of the development and subsequent testing of nuclear weapons as for the good of mankind, articulated so evocatively by Kathy Jetnall-Kinchner in her poem, History Project, is not something specific to the Pacific. The belief in mutually assured destruction, the notion that the immense power of nuclear weapons in themselves prevented war throughout the late 20th century is widely held. But in Australia, as elsewhere, nuclear war has been waged for decades, and the phrase, "for the good of mankind," alludes to the colonial and gendered frames through which the nuclear is so often viewed, but also experienced. Nuclear testing sites are sites of significant contestation, sites where the inherent violence of nuclear weapons has played out in various manifestations, physical, military, and environmental violence enacted upon gendered and racialized bodies. For example, the South Australian desert landscapes around Maralinga and Emu Field are overflowing with life and significance, yet are marked by radioactive conflict that has a history and several legacies. The idea that nuclear weapons enact violence is not novel. Neither is it groundbreaking to suggest that nuclear weapons enact specific forms of violence, gendered, racialized, environmental. In fact, in 2017, even the United Nations acknowledged the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons industries on Indigenous peoples, as well as women and girls. They acknowledge the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons that cannot be adequately addressed. They transcend national borders, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socioeconomic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations. Nuclear weapons are therefore undoubtedly tied up in narratives of violence by virtue of being a weapon. However, other forms of nuclear processes are less commonly considered for their specific violence. Yet, as I intend to show, every element of the nuclear fuel cycle, from mining to processing to waste dumping, enacts violence in some way. In the short time I have today, I want to consider the environmental violence wrought by nuclear processes in Australia, violence that I see existing on at least two temporal scales: the immediate physical harm inflicted upon people and environments through the act of mining radioactive minerals, testing nuclear weapons, and dumping waste, and the almost unfathomable nuclear half-life, which exists on an insurmountable timescale, capable of altering the environments and the bodies that exist within them for hundreds of thousands of years. On both scales, nuclear processes facilitate significant intergenerational trauma, colonizing bodies and spaces, both in order to take place and as a result of their existence. This colonization, a phenomenon I refer to as nuclear colonialism, both necessitates and exists as a byproduct of environmental violence. And nowhere, in my research at least, is this more stark than in South Australia. Now, South Australia has been home to every step of the nuclear fuel cycle, and I believe it remains one of the only places in the world where a sovereign government agreed to the testing of nuclear weapons by a foreign nation on their soil and people. It is a history steeped in imperialism, and the legacies of this episode continue to play out, especially as Aboriginal nuclear survivors have become increasingly vocal about their experiences. But South Australia has an important nuclear history that transcends just nuclear testing. South Australia has been home to radium mining beginning in 1906, and with a bit of a link to Douglas Mawson. Douglas Mawson actually discovered radium in Australia, in South Australia specifically. Uranium mining booming in the 1980s, and nuclear weapons testing, which plagued the desert between 1952 and 1963, but also resurfaced as an issue during the McClelland Royal Commission in the mid-1980s. But there are also examples in South Australia of attempted environmental violence, such as the 1998 proposal to create an international radioactive waste dump near Coober Pedy, or this issue has just resurfaced with the proposal of a waste dump at Kimba. But just naming these processes does little in the way of highlighting the environmental violence imposed by the nuclear, nor does it illuminate the specific manifestations of nuclear colonialism that they facilitated. Now, importantly, nuclear processes require rhetoric that erases bodies and meaning from the landscape. Feminist scholar Tracy Bryan-Voiles refers to this as wastelanding, the act of rendering landscapes waste and thus disposable. Think of Western notions of desert, and the language used to articulate them are a prime example, and were used in each of these aforementioned historical examples, including with the current nuclear waste dump. For example, when one thinks of Maralinga and Emu Field, inhospitable sandscapes come to mind, rather than the spinifex and cane grass that pits so much of the South Australian desert, sustained by groundwater from the Great Artesian Basin, a landscape that was peopled for tens of thousands of years prior to the nuclear test, but has since been mostly unpeopled for the safety of the population. But proponents of nuclear processes do not merely enact nuclear colonialism by utilising rhetoric to render landscapes figuratively empty, uninhabitable, and thus able to be contaminated, but radioactivity renders lands literally uninhabitable for hundreds to thousands to potentially hundreds of thousands of years. And here we can see how nuclear colonialism's enactment of environmental violence also works on two temporal scales, the immediate and the ubiquitous. Illuminating these timescales is the lived experiences and stories of nuclear survivors in South Australia. And for the rest of my presentation, I wish to turn to this, discussing the human impact of the environmental violence wrought by nuclear processes. This photograph is of Yami Leicester, taken by anti-nuclear activist and photographer Jess Boylan a few years ago. Now, Yami Leicester was a Yankunytjatjara man from the central deserts of South Australia, born in 1941. And in the early 1950s, during one of the earlier nuclear tests conducted by the British, Yami and his family and those around him were engulfed in what they referred to as a black mist. He described the burning of his eyes and the illnesses that befell his companions. Yami began to struggle with his sight and was later completely blind. Now, by 1984, Yami had become a vocal advocate against the nuclear industry in Australia and became a key witness in the 1984-5 Royal Commission into the British nuclear test in Australia. The Royal Commission confirmed that cleanup efforts by the British had done little to make the environment safe for people visiting, let alone those wishing to once again live on country. In the late 1990s, Yami's aunt, Emily Brown, heard word that the South Australian government was contemplating a nuclear waste dump on her country near Coober Pedy. Emily, along with other members of the Coober Pedy Kungajucha, the Coober Pedy Senior Women's Group, decided to take on the government, writing to ministers, "It must be deadly poison if they want to bring it all the way over here. We've had enough of this poison, enough sickness from the bomb. We knew enough about the Irati poison from when we were young girls. We knew we had to fight it." They knew they had to fight it, not least due to the effect that the waste would have on the land, the water, their land and their water, land and water that provided them and their community with physical and spiritual nourishment. They articulated their relationship with the environment as such. "We were born on the earth, not in the hospital. We were born in the sand. We really know the land. From a baby, we grew up on the land. Never mind our country is the desert. That's where we belong. And we love where we belong. The whole land. We know the stories." Part of knowing the land for the Kungas was rejecting settler colonial notions of the desert as lifeless, uninhabitable, disposable waste, and thus the ideal site for enacting environmental violence that could last millennia. They implored the government to listen. "Listen to us," they wrote in an open letter. "The desert lands are not as dry as you think. Can't the government plainly see that there is water here? Nothing can live without water. We know that the poison from the radioactive dump will go down under the ground and leak into the water. We drink from this water. The animals drink from this water." This message proved a powerful one, as the Kungas articulated their integral connection to the land as a source of knowledge and life, not just a resource to be extracted or a site to be laid to waste. Importantly, one of the Kungas' greatest support bases and their reason for fighting so hard was actually the younger generation. Karina Leicester, Yami Leicester's daughter, who refers lovingly to Emily Brown as Nana, was in her late teens and early 20s throughout the Irati Wanti campaign being held by the Coober Pedy Kungas. And she actually translated for the women, spreading their stories in English. Now today, Karina remains one of Australia's most foremost anti-nuclear activists. She was integral in the negotiations to formulate the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, addressing the UN in 2017 as a member of civil society, describing the intergenerational trauma experienced by her family and Indigenous communities all over the world as a result of environmental destruction. Environmental destruction that would persist for an unfathomable length of time, she reminded the Security Council. In a recent conversation I had with Karina, she described Aboriginal connection to land as of great significance to her fight against the nuclear, a fight that she interprets as being to save the environment and humankind from the consequences of the nuclear order. She expressed that the enactment of nuclear processes on Indigenous lands in Australia demonstrates the clash between Aboriginal understandings of and use of the land and settler desires to exploit it for political and economic gain. She also described the way that her children are involved in the fight against the nuclear. She told me very lovingly about her son recently drawing a picture of her grandfather alongside the words of Paul Kelly's song, "This is a Rainy Land," a song that's actually written partly about Karina's father and her son William's grandfather, Yami Leicester. And William insisted that everyone should know his grandfather's story, as well as the story of the rest of his community. Now, the stories of Yami, Emily, Karina, and briefly William, all interconnected, provide insight into the intergenerational nature of radioactivity, of nuclear colonialism, and the environmental violence they enact. The intergenerational trauma experienced by Aboriginal people in Australia mirrors that highlighted by Kathy Jetnall-Kitchener in History Project and communities across the Pacific. It is both immediate, existing within the lifetimes of those exposed to the nuclear, but also seemingly timeless as the physical consequences of radioactive exposure slowly reveal themselves generation after generation. In bringing this brief discussion of the human and environmental consequences of the nuclear to a close, I want to play you another video, bookending this presentation with the voices of Indigenous people from different communities and countries, but demonstrating the shared experience of many nuclear survivors. So I leave you with the words of the global Indigenous community spoken by Karina Leicester at the United Nations in 2017.
I would like to take this opportunity to read 2 paragraphs from an important statement that has been prepared for the conference. It has been endorsed by Indigenous groups in many countries, in particular Australia, French Polynesia, United States, Marshall Islands. And the 2 paragraphs I'd like to read this. We write to remind those drafting this important new treaty about the ongoing harm caused by the use of nuclear weapons and by more than 2,000 nuclear test explosions around the globe. Indigenous communities have borne the brunt of these deadly experiments. Our land, our sea, our communities, and our physical bodies carry this legacy with us now and for unknown generations to come. Our suffering cannot be undone. Our lands can never be restored. Some of our customs will never be revived and will forever remain disrupted. We hope that in this new treaty to ban nuclear weapons, governments will at last acknowledge and make reparation for the harm inflicted upon Indigenous peoples, communities, lands, and sea. Your work on this treaty is a historic opportunity towards ensuring that there are no new victims of nuclear weapons. Thank you.